The morning I found out I owned the water under Silverpine Lake, I thought life had finally handed me one clean win, but by sunset, a woman in a pearl-white Mercedes was standing on my gravel drive telling me I owed her $600 a month to touch my own lake, and if I did not pay, she would have my dock torn down. That was my first conversation with Bianca Holloway, president of the Pinecrest Shores HOA, a woman who smiled like a church lady and threatened people like a mob boss with better stationery. I remember standing there with lake wind in my face, an old deed folded inside my jacket, thinking, ma'am, you have no idea whose family you just picked a fight with. My name is Caleb Mercer, and 6 months before all this, I was nobody important, just a 43-year-old widower, former civil engineer, living above a hardware store in western Montana, trying to keep my life small because small things hurt less when they break. Then my Aunt Rosalie died and left me what I thought was a fishing cabin, some timberland, and a headache full of taxes. Her lawyer, Mr. Ben Halbrook, slid the paperwork across his desk like he was passing me a loaded gun. Caleb, he said, your great-great-grandfather did not just buy Shoreline in 1891, he bought the spring rights, the lakebed rights, the overflow channel, and every water use privilege attached to it. I laughed because I thought he was being dramatic. Then he showed me the map. 2,200 acres of water, pine, rock, and old family stubbornness, sitting right behind a gated community that had spent 15 years pretending it owned everything pretty enough to photograph. The first time I drove out there, I smelled wet cedar before I even saw the water, and for the first time since my wife passed, something in my chest loosened. The dock was crooked, gray, and beautiful, built by men who measured twice, cursed once, and expected wood to outlive them. I was standing on it, listening to the boards creak like old bones, when Bianca's car came crunching up the drive. She stepped out in cream slacks, gold sunglasses, and that kind of calm rich people use when they have already decided you are beneath them. You must be the new problem, she said. Not owner, not neighbor, problem. I told her my name. She held up a violation notice between two manicured fingers and said my dock was unsafe, my shoreline was unauthorized, and my lake access fee was already overdue. I said, Bianca, I own the lake. She gave me a soft little laugh, the kind you give a child who says he wants to be an astronaut. Mr. Mercer, she said, this is a community resource. I looked past her at the water my family had protected for over a century, and I felt something wake up in me that grief had nearly buried. She slapped the notice onto my truck windshield and leaned close enough for me to smell her expensive perfume. 30 days, she whispered, or we begin foreclosure proceedings. Now. I had spent years designing bridges in flood country, reading contracts nobody else wanted to touch, and I knew one thing for sure, water always remembers where it belongs. Bianca thought she was scaring some broke outsider with paperwork. What she did not know was that I still had the original 1891 deed, and by the time I unfolded it, her whole little kingdom was going to start leaking from the foundation. The next week turned into a full-time war, the kind that starts with paperwork and ends with people showing their real faces. Every morning, I'd wake up to another certified letter taped to my gate like Bianca Holloway was trying to wallpaper my property with threats. Environmental violations. Unauthorized shoreline modifications. Community nuisance complaints. One notice claimed my old fishing boat was psychologically damaging property values, which honestly sounded less like legal language and more like something written by a woman who had never heard the word embarrassment. But the strange thing was, none of it actually scared me. Annoyed me, sure. Cost me sleep, absolutely. But fear? No. Grief had already burned most of that out of me years ago. Losing my wife had a way of changing your relationship with intimidation. Once life breaks you for real, rich people with clipboards stop feeling all that powerful. I started spending my mornings at the county archives downtown, digging through records that smelled like dust, mildew, and forgotten arguments. The clerk down there, an 80-year-old woman named Dolores, took one look at Bianca's notices and snorted loud enough to echo off the basement walls. "Honey," she said, "that HOA's been bluffing folks for 15 years because nobody bothers checking old deeds anymore. Turns out my family's ownership rights weren't just old, they were practically untouchable. The Mercer deed predated state zoning laws, county shoreline regulations, and every HOA document Pinecrest Shores had ever filed. My great-great-grandfather had written protections into the original contract so aggressive it read less like a land purchase and more like a warning shot. Exclusive spring access. Water diversion authority. Permanent easement protections. Bianca wasn't charging me to use the lake. Legally speaking, she was standing on my family's property every time she walked near the shoreline. That realization hit me so hard I actually laughed alone in the archives room. Loud, ugly laughing, too. The kind where people think maybe you've snapped a little. That evening I met Evan Pike at Rosie's Diner, a young attorney fresh out of Bozeman with student loans, cheap suits, and the dangerous enthusiasm of someone who still believed justice worked if you pushed hard enough. He spread the documents across our table while country music hummed softly overhead and old men argued about trout fishing near the counter. "Caleb," he said, "this woman's entire HOA structure depends on people never challenging jurisdiction. They've been operating like a private government without actual authority." He tapped the easement map with the eraser end of his pencil. "And this right here, this destroys her." The map showed something neither Bianca nor I had known before. The community marina, half the walking trail, and Bianca's own private boat dock all crossed directly through Mercer easement land. Technically, if I wanted to be difficult, I could shut down access to half the luxury waterfront amenities in Pinecrest Shores. I stared at the map while coffee steam curled between us. Funny thing about power, people only notice it when someone threatens to take it away. Evan leaned back grinning. "You know what really scares people like Bianca? Public humiliation. Not lawsuits. Not money. Exposure." The next HOA meeting happened Thursday night inside a clubhouse that looked like a ski lodge designed by people who hated warmth. Stone fireplace, polished wood beams, expensive leather chairs, and underneath all of it, tension thick enough to choke on. Bianca stood at the front with perfect posture and television anchor hair, speaking to the room like she was addressing Congress. "Community integrity must be protected," she announced. "Certain individuals have demonstrated hostility toward shared neighborhood values." Then she looked directly at me. "Funny how some people smile while trying to bury you alive." I sat quietly through 20 minutes of nonsense about shoreline compliance and aesthetic harmony before finally standing up. Chairs creaked. Forks paused. You ever notice how silence sounds heavier in rich rooms? Miss Holloway, I said calmly, before we continue discussing violations, maybe we should clarify who actually owns the lake. Her expression barely moved, but I saw it, that tiny flicker behind her eyes. She hadn't expected resistance. Evan handed me the deed folder and I placed copies across the front table one by one. Original Mercer Water Rights Deed, filed 1891. Easement surveys. Spring control maps. Certified county verification. Bianca glanced down at the paperwork and for the first time since I met her, the woman looked uncertain. Just for a second, but long enough. According to county records, I continued, your HOA has zero legal authority over pre-existing Mercer property. Which means every fine issued against me is fraudulent. And while we're here, your private dock appears to sit directly on my easement. The room exploded. People started talking over each other so fast it sounded like birds scattering before a storm. One board member actually whispered what the hell under his breath loud enough for everyone to hear. Bianca's smile tightened like stretched wire. These are outdated technicalities, she snapped. Community governance supersedes obsolete property arrangements. Evan almost laughed out loud. No ma'am, he said, law supersedes community newsletters. A couple people in the back actually clapped at that. Bianca turned pale. Then came the moment I realized this was no longer just about rules or pride. It was about money. A man near the fireplace stood up and asked the question that changed the entire room. Bianca, if Caleb owns the water access rights, what happens to the marina expansion project? Dead silence. There it was. The real reason she had come after me so aggressively. Pinecrest Shores had been negotiating some luxury waterfront development deal, condos, boat slips, private rentals, the whole country club fantasy package. And none of it worked without guaranteed lake access. My lake access. Bianca tried recovering fast, but panic had already slipped into her voice. The development discussions are unrelated to current enforcement actions. Which in lawyer language basically means yes, absolutely related. After the meeting, people avoided eye contact with her in the parking lot. You could feel the shift happening in real time. Fear changing sides. Bianca stopped me beside my truck just as I opened the door. The cold mountain wind carried pine needles across the pavement while clubhouse lights glowed behind her. You think this makes you powerful? She asked quietly. No, I told her honestly. I think it makes you desperate. Her jaw tightened. You have no idea how much money is riding on this development. There it was again, honesty slipping out through anger. I leaned against the truck and looked at her for a long moment. You know what's funny, Bianca? My family protected this lake through floods, droughts, and 2 world wars, and somehow the biggest threat it ever faced was a homeowners association with a logo. She stared at me like she wanted to slap me, sue me, or maybe both. Then she said something I still think about sometimes. People like you don't understand how the world works anymore, Caleb. Ownership is leverage. Control is survival. And for the first time, I realized Bianca Holloway wasn't just arrogant. She was terrified. Terrified of losing status, money, influence, terrified of becoming ordinary. But desperate people make reckless decisions, and as she climbed back into that pearl-white Mercedes, I had a feeling the worst part of this story was only beginning. 3 nights later, somebody cut the power to my cabin at exactly 1:13 in the morning. I remember the time because grief still made me a light sleeper, and when the refrigerator hum disappeared, my eyes opened instantly. Outside, Silverpine Lake was black and silent except for wind moving through the trees like whispers passing between old ghosts. Then I heard footsteps near the dock. Slow. Careful. Human. I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed and stepped onto the porch barefoot, cold wood pressing against my feet. At first I saw nothing but darkness and moving water, then the beam caught somebody crouched near the dock posts. The guy bolted immediately, slipping through the shoreline brush like a raccoon with a criminal record. By the time I reached the water, he was already tearing off in a small aluminum fishing boat with no lights. But he left something floating near the dock. Bolt cutters. Brand new ones. Cheap hardware store steel still shining under the flashlight beam. That was the moment the whole thing stopped being petty HOA warfare and became something uglier. By sunrise, Deputy Nate Coulter was standing on my porch drinking terrible coffee from one of my chipped mugs while reviewing security footage from the cameras Evan convinced me to install. The grainy video clearly showed a masked man trying to sever my dock cables before panicking and running. Nate shook his head slowly. "Caleb, this isn't harassment anymore. This is felony vandalism. Maybe conspiracy, too." I stared out at the lake while dawn light spread across the water like melted copper. You know what bothered me most? Not the sabotage. Not even the threats. It was realizing Bianca hated losing more than she cared about right or wrong. People like that will burn entire communities down before admitting they were wrong in public. Evan arrived around noon looking like he hadn't slept. His tie was crooked, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had the kind of energy lawyers get when they discover something catastrophic. "Caleb, we found the money." Turns out Bianca's luxury marina deal wasn't just some side project. Pinecrest Shores was nearly bankrupt. Years of hidden legal bills, private consulting payments, and failed expansion loans had drained the HOA reserves dry. Worse than that, Bianca had secretly promised developers guaranteed water control before she even legally had it. She sold them certainty using property she didn't own. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, suddenly understanding everything. The fake violations. The intimidation. The obsession with pushing me out fast. This woman hadn't just wanted control. She needed it to save herself. Evan dropped another folder onto the table. Bank records. Internal emails. Private contracts. Bianca Holloway had been funneling HOA money through shell companies connected to her brother's real estate firm. Hundreds of thousands of dollars disguised as environmental consulting fees and shoreline studies. "Jesus," I muttered. Evan nodded grimly. "If this gets out publicly, she's done." That same evening, Bianca called an emergency community meeting. Funny how dictators always call things emergencies once the walls start closing in. The clubhouse parking lot overflowed before sunset. Homeowners packed the room shoulder to shoulder while local reporters hovered near the entrance sensing blood in the water. Bianca stood at the front wearing a navy blazer and pearls like armor, but the confidence was gone now. You could hear it in her voice. Tonight, she announced, we face a coordinated attack against the future of this community. Then she looked directly at me. Certain individuals have chosen selfish obstruction over collective prosperity. The room shifted uncomfortably. People were no longer sure who the villain was anymore. That uncertainty scared her more than anything. Bianca launched into a dramatic presentation about environmental responsibility and economic growth, but halfway through, Evan stood up holding the financial records. Actually, he interrupted calmly, I think residents deserve to know where their HOA dues have really been going. The silence hit hard. Real hard. Evan walked to the front table and laid the documents down one by one while reporters immediately pushed closer. Unauthorized transfers. Shell companies. Development kickbacks. Private consulting fraud. Every page peeled another layer off Bianca's carefully polished image. One woman near the back gasped when she recognized her own special assessment payments listed inside the records. An older man stood up trembling with anger. My wife postponed cancer treatment because you told us the HOA reserve fund was collapsing. Bianca's composure finally cracked. This is manipulation, she snapped. These documents are stolen. Caleb Mercer is trying to destroy this community because he refuses to cooperate. I looked around the room at people who suddenly seemed exhausted more than angry. Families. Retirees. Neighbors. Folks who just wanted somewhere peaceful to live. And I realized Bianca had spent years convincing everyone fear was governance. No, I said quietly. You destroyed this place yourself. The room went dead silent again. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the mountains. Deputy Nate stepped forward beside the entrance, calm and steady. Bianca Holloway, he said, we have enough evidence to open a formal criminal investigation into financial fraud and abuse of community funds. For the first time all night, Bianca looked small. Not powerful. Not terrifying. Just tired and cornered and terrified of losing the version of herself she spent years building. Then she whispered something almost nobody heard except me standing closest to the front. I did all this because I could not stand becoming invisible. That line stuck with me longer than everything else. Because honestly, I think a lot of people become cruel for exactly that reason. Not greed. Not power. Fear of disappearing. Nate escorted her out while reporters shouted questions and camera flashes lit the parking lot like lightning. And just like that, the Queen of Pinecrest Shores walked out through the same doors she once controlled like a courtroom. 6 months later, Silverpine Lake feels alive again. The HOA board got rebuilt from scratch. The fake violations disappeared. Families started using the shoreline without fear of getting fined for breathing incorrectly. Evan opened his own practice helping homeowners fight abusive HOAs across the state. And me? I stayed. Funny enough, I almost sold the place at first. But some mornings I sit on that old dock with coffee in my hands watching fog drift across the water, and for the first time in years, life feels quiet in a good way. Not empty. Just peaceful. Sometimes I still think about Bianca Holloway, though. About what happens when people confuse control with purpose. Maybe she deserved what happened. Maybe she didn't. Honestly, I still go back and forth on that myself. But here's what I want to know from you guys. If somebody spent years manipulating an entire community, lying, intimidating people, stealing money, but deep down they were really just terrified of losing status and becoming irrelevant, does that excuse any of it? Or do people eventually become responsible for the monsters they turn into? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling this one's going to divide people.